Welcome to the 10th Lynn W. Day Distinguished Lectureship in Forest and Conservation History, sponsored by the Forest History Society, the Duke University Department of History, and the Nicholas School of the Environment. In addition to our audience here in Love Auditorium, we welcome our colleagues at the Duke Marine Laboratory in Beaufort, North Carolina, where they are receiving the lecture by video conference. The Distinguished Lectureship seeks to recognize a scholar or leader in natural resources that is shaping our understanding of human history and environmental change. In addition to recognizing evolving scholarship, the lectureships aim to be accessible to a broad audience on unique and provocative topics and philosophies. They all consider elements of the moral challenge of living sustainably on the earth. Information about the previous lectures given by noted environmental historians William Cronin, Stephen Pine, Donald Worster, Patricia Limerick, among others, can be found on the Forest History Society's website at www.foresthistory.org. The lectureship was named for Lynn Weyerhaeuser Day, a longtime supporter of the Forest History Society. She was committed to forest conservation, environmental issues, human welfare, and international development. She firmly believed that the lessons of history can help us ask better questions, questions that will, in turn, lead to better decisions now and in the future. This lecture has been approved for 1 hour of continuing forestry education credit by the Society of American Foresters, and it has been approved for 1 credit hour towards a North Carolina Environmental Education Certificate Program. If you're interested in the CFE credit hours, please make sure you sign the roster outside the door upstairs and pick up your certificate. Following the lecture, you are invited to join us for a reception downstairs in the Hall of Science. Our speaker today is Dr. Roderick Nash, who will be speaking on the meaning of wilderness and the rights of nature. Dr. Nash is Professor Emeritus in Environmental Studies and the History Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is considered America's foremost wilderness historian. He is regarded as a national leader in the field of environmental history and management and environmental education. Among his numerous books and over 150 essays, Professor Nash is best known for Wilderness and the American Mind, which Outside Magazine recognized as one of the books that changed our world. Initially published by Yale University Press in 1967, it recently enjoyed an extensively revised 4th edition that appeared in 2001 to celebrate the book's status as one of the all-time Yale bestsellers. In his lecture, he will also draw on his 1989 book, The Rights of Nature, A History of Environmental Ethics. Professor Nash earned a Bachelor of Arts from Harvard University and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Arriving at Santa Barbara in 1966, he served as chairman of the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara from 1970 to 1975, and again from 1992 to 1993. After witnessing a massive oil spill in Santa Barbara in 1969, he and a number of other faculty members became active within the university and founded the Environmental Studies program there. Since the initial 12 graduates in 1972, there have been 4,000 graduates of the Environmental Studies program. Nash is a firm believer in environmental education and is also an avid whitewater rafter. He is a professional whitewater rafting guide and has completed over 60 descents of the Colorado to Grand Canyon. I would also lastly mention that this afternoon he mentioned a story in 1961 as a graduate student. He was responsible for saving some of the papers of Aldo Leopold from his wife and then spent the summer processing that collection. And it's difficult to say how historiography or history as we know it might have changed if he had not accomplished that feat for all of us. It is our honor to have him with us here today. Please help me welcome Dr. Roderick Nash.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for coming. It's good to be here for the Lynn W. Day lecture. It's good to be in North Carolina, a place I take to be one of the starting points for forestry, conservation, and what we later called environmentalism in this country. I'm thinking particularly of Gifford Pinchot, newly graduated from Yale in 1889. And at that time, one of his classmates asked him, what are you going to be, Gifford, after you graduate? And he said, I'm going to be a forester. And his friend said, what's that? And Gifford Pinchot said, that's why I want to be a forester. Profession didn't exist. And in 1890, after a trip to Europe, he came back and took the first job as a professional forester in the United States, working for the Vanderbilt family up the road here in Asheville. So North Carolina has an important position in that development. I am also happy to have gone to the Forest History Society headquarters today over on William Vickers Avenue, and I asked one of their talented archivists and research people to pull out a couple of articles that I had written for the journal Forest History back in the 1960s, and 3 minutes later, there they are. So I was kind of fun to see one of the birthplaces of Wilderness in the American Mind book there, and if there are any scholars, people at the Nicholas School here who need help in research on environmental topics, the Forest History Society would be a great place to start. So today, we're going to do several things. I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, Wilderness in the American Mind. That's the third edition. And I think it's a good book. It may have even, as Steve was kind enough to say, an outside magazine, be a book that changed the world a little bit. But it's also important to recognize in the 1960s that the world was ready to be changed. This was the 60s after all, right? Anybody who remembers it couldn't have been there, as they say. But it was a time of countercultural questioning. It was a time of ecological understanding, really the birthplace of the word ecology in our vocabulary, and a time of 1960s environmentalism and extraordinary acts that passed by Congress through that decade. It's important to remember that I turned in my dissertation in Madison, Wisconsin in 1964, the same year as the passage of the Wilderness Act. So that's what I mean by a lucky book. And I was also fortunate, I think, in that as I started my career, an event occurred that Steve alluded to in the Santa Barbara Channel, the so-called Santa Barbara oil spill. Some of you may have heard of oil spills, and you've seen oil gushers on land, but this one occurred offshore, occurred in the ocean, and created a black tide, a blowout of a well in the ocean. And those of us at UC Santa Barbara responded by saying, what can we do in our chosen line of work as professors and as academics to address problems like this? And one of our responses was to create an environmental studies major, one of the first in the country that we opened doors for in 1970. So I'm happy to see the Nicholas School continuing on in that path of making problems rather than disciplines the focus of higher education. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Wilderness in the American Mind, a book in which I discussed one of the most remarkable revolutions in the history of ideas, changes in attitude toward nature, a revolution that transformed wilderness from something that was hated and feared to something that was cherished and preserved. And in the American context, that change over several thousand years was compressed into just several decades toward the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, centered around the so-called ending of the frontier in 1890, same year. Some of you will recognize that Gifford Pinchot started in with his forestry career. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And being a professor, I do have a little handout, which I think some of you have in your hands. And I may even ask a quiz or two along the way. So we'll get ready for that. The second book I'm going to talk about is The Rights of Nature, which is in some ways a sequel to Wilderness in the American Mind, and it concerns the extension of ethics, the idea of an ethical community that could expand, and I'm interested in how it might expand to include not even just non-human species, but also possibly such so-called non-living ones as mountains and rivers. And I am interested in the way that the natural rights idea expanded all the way in some thinkers' minds to include the rights of nature. In this book, I'm writing as a historian, not an advocate, but I'm writing as an historian, and I'm talking about finding in our Western liberal tradition the sources of an environmental ethic, suggesting to you that we don't have to go to Native American traditions or to Asian traditions, but that we can find them right here at home. And finally, I'm going to stretch our minds a bit toward the end of the talk, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a proposal for a new way of occupying this planet, something I've been thinking about a bit. Historians think in long-range terms, and I'm thinking about 1,000 years out and where our species might be on this planet and where this planet might be. And I'm going to talk about an idea that I call island civilization. So we'll explore that as we go down the pike. First, I'd like to just share with you a little bit about where I'm coming from, what my background is. This is the view from my bedroom window for 20 years in Greenwich Village. Not a village, as some of you know, but part of a much bigger apple called New York City. When I was a city kid, I lived down in Greenwich Village. I could look out that window and only see this wall, not see a single living thing, not a leaf, not a weed, not a blade of grass. Couldn't even see the stars at night. And I was part of this incredible, talk about a linear left-brained environment, huh? I drove around Durham a little today. I didn't see square blocks like this. And it's interesting to me that city kids like myself came to want to write about wilderness and appreciate wilderness. Theodore Roosevelt grew up in the upper right-hand corner of that picture, and Robert Marshall, as in the Bob Marshall Wilderness area in Montana, also grew up in the area, the blocks that are shown in that city. As a kid, I was a lot like Otis and his friend here, who you can see are opting out of your polluted environment and middle-class values. We're going to the forest to be raised by wolves. So what's going on here? Who is this? Romulus and Remus. Gosh, it's good to be back in the university, huh? I talked about this the other day, and somebody said, oh yeah, Romulus and Remus were raised in the jungle by apes. I said, no, that was Tarzan. And so Romulus and Remus, yeah, the twins who allegedly founded Rome. And this was an extremely important metaphor to Americans, among them Henry David Thoreau, who realized that the wild roots, the wild background of Rome may have contributed to its greatness, and that when Rome declined and fell and wilder people swept in and wiped them out, they had lost their contact with their wild roots. They had ceased to become, in Thoreau's terms, half savages. So that idea of being raised by wolves and thinking that the New World and North America as a wilderness was that wolf, and that maybe we were in danger of losing that contact, very important strain in American thought. So in New York City, it was, that's a pretty good cartoon, isn't it? Is he going to take it, or is he watching Monday Night Football? Is he going to take that call of the wild? Where was I going to hear that call of the wild? And I was particularly sensitive to this because I knew one of my ancestors was Simon Fraser. Simon Fraser, the third person across the continent, Mackenzie being the first, Lewis and Clark the second party, Fraser, the mouth of the Fraser River where Vancouver is today, leading that expedition in 1808. And I was aware of being related to him and thinking about the kind of world that he occupied and the kind of world that I was coming into, and where was I going to find that place to be raised by wolves. And this was one place I found it in the Grand Canyon. As Steve mentioned, I've spent a lot of time below the rim. They say what happens below the rim, stays below the rim, and running the big rapids on the Colorado, finding, in my terms, a new frontier, and finding frontiersmen, who were those people who ran boats down there. How many of you have ever run the Colorado through Grand Canyon? Cool, a few. The rest of you, get out there. It's getting a little deeper, but still worth it. Just take a look at this rapid for a minute. The river's going from right to left, and we're going to close in on the tongue of that rapid right there in the center. And these are the dories that we talked about a little today at lunch, that we run down this river. They're hard boats, not inflatables. And let's close in a little bit more, and you can begin to see 5 people in that boat. And this is kind of what I did for years, totally misspent middle age. Now you have the handouts, and I want to start by talking a little bit about the definition of wilderness. Take a look at those handouts if you have one, or if you can look at your neighbors. And we're talking about a rather slippery word here, the word wilderness, defining it as sort of like nailing Jell-O to the wall. And it's the problem with the word wilderness is that I think it's a perceived reality. A mountain, a river, a canyon are real things. You can point to one and say, that's a mountain. Most people would agree, that's a mountain. Yeah, it's a mountain. Is it a wild mountain? Is it a wilderness? That's where you might have some disagreement. Look at your diagram and you see, I think, a way I would encourage you not to think about wilderness, and that is on that upper left where we just have wilderness and civilization, right? Is that the upper left with a straight line between them? Yeah. And kind of the idea that you're either in wilderness or you're in civilization. What I'd rather commend to you is the diagram on the other side of the page with the diagonal line running through it. And here we can talk about wilderness as a state of mind. We can talk about it as a perceived reality. And we can realize that wilderness is a quality, and there may be some wildness or some wilderness in almost any landscape, and some qualities of control or civilization. And how we perceive that moves back and forth like that arrow at the top suggests, according to our point of view. The history of the concept of wilderness brings us back about 10,000 years before present to the beginning of herding and agriculture, where our species, where our species started to draw lines on the map and started to say there were some things we controlled and some things we didn't control. And it was that point when we began to develop a strong bias against things that were uncontrolled or wild. And we tried our best to keep what we controlled inside. Look at this slide with me for a minute. This is an African corral, or manyatta as it's called, and inside it are sheep and cows. This is a really big corral. And outside the thorn fence is wild country and where the wild things are. So as we bet the farm on the farm and really went with herding and agriculture, we began to make those kinds of distinctions. So you could say that civilization created wilderness. Prior to civilization, and by that I mean settling down, herding and agriculture, prior to that in hunting-gathering times, it didn't make much sense to talk about things that were wild or country that was wilderness because it was all perceived as just simply habitat. But when the fences and the control began, then it became possible to talk about domestic animals versus wild ones. Now, the history of the word in Old English brings us to an interesting concept, the word will in English. It's a word that we don't use too much. We use it sometimes to express intent or desire. I will go to this lecture. I will go to a concert tonight. But it's even a more powerful word than that. We talk about free will. We talk about someone having a last will. We sometimes just call it a will. Where there's a will, there's a way. Where there's a will, there are relatives. We understand that. So wilderness really means, etymologically, self-willed land. Land that has its own will. land where will, or a place where will has not been broken. You know that concept of breaking the will? We break the will, we break a horse. Maybe we whisper to the horse, but we break the will of the horse. So it ceases to become a wild horse and it becomes a domestic horse. And that idea of breaking the will, I think, is an important one. And I'd like you to bear in mind that concept, or write down on that little handout you have the idea self-willed land. Self-willed land. Real wilderness means that we respect that independence. And real wilderness preservation, I think, means being gardeners, not being gardeners, but being guardians. Being guardians and not gardeners. It's very tempting for managers to try to overmanage wilderness, I believe, and biologists as well, exotic species, fire, and so forth. Letting it alone, letting it be self-willed is a little harder to do. So with those sort of definitions in mind, let's take a little bit of look at American history, some of the background of our attitudes. Big point being, as we started out, we didn't like wilderness very much. We went back to some of the original fears of herding and agriculture, early pastoral people as they settled down, trying to keep the wild things at bay. Here's the Mayflower, a couple of people talking. You can't read that, but I can. It says, one guy on the Mayflower, looking at each other, 1620, says, "Religious freedom is my immediate goal, but my long-range plan is to go into real estate." Oh yeah, we understand that, don't we? We sell the earth. And this idea that the earth can be bought and sold, that we can control it in this manner, became as American as apple pie. This idea of striking it rich, turning the land from an undeveloped condition to a developed one, became the way of American development. And we did think there was room for millions. This is an 1880s advertisement from California. Look at that, climate for health and wealth, room for millions. Now we're worried about immigrants in California. Maybe we got too many. But back then, we've got plenty of climate, it says at the bottom, for health and wealth without cyclones or buzzards. I think it actually says blizzards. But that would not be something you'd want to ask the Donner Party about. So here's everything we need to know about American history, my friends. Look at this. This is a picture called American Progress, 1869. It's really not a very great painting by a man by the name of Gast, G-A-S-T. But look at it in 1869. Here we have in the center Miss America going across the West, holding in her hands the Bible and stringing out the telegraph wire as she goes across the plains. And over on the right, you can see the sunshine, the ordered, the controlled environment of civilization. And then going west is American history. There come the railroads. The first one was completed, transcontinental, the same year, right? 1869, Promontory Point, May 10th, 1869, Golden Spike. Same picture, same year. And there go the covered wagons, there go the miners. Into the mountains on the far left go the Indians and wild animals, dark, storm clouds, wilderness, scary place, from godliness to the satanic realm of the wilderness. This was called, remember the title of the picture, American Progress. This is how we define progress. Growth and progress almost thought to be synonymous. So what I really like about this picture is if you look in the far right-hand corner up there, you can see two rivers coming together. Can you see that? And there's a bridge over one of the rivers. That would be New York City, and the Brooklyn Bridge, which was being built in 1869, right? We got a homeboy here, Steve and me. And if you look really closely, you can see the wall that I grew up staring at. Not really, but you know, this to me is kind of the whole story. So we've continued with that theme on into the late 20th century. Where do you want it moved? We can move mountains. Another Fortune 500 company ad. Look at that. I mean, and we wonder what's wrong with us. And it says in the fine print, it may seem on the surface we have a resource problem, whereas it's really just a question of squeezing a little harder. And there's the earth cut in half like a grapefruit and being squeezed out over a what do you call those things you squeeze grapefruits on? Juicer. Right, thank you. And there come all the goodies out from the earth. So here's a philosophy that is something we've had to overcome, and it's quite amazing that we have as much as we have and appreciate wilderness as much as we do. Let's look at some of the people on the other side of the fence. Thoreau, July 4th, 1845, goes to Walden Pond. Interesting choice of date, Henry. He picked it because he wanted to make what we call today a statement. And his statement was, I don't want to celebrate red, white, and blue firecrackers. I don't think that America's on the right track. I don't like the war with Mexico. I don't like the development that's eating up the wolf, the she-wolf, the self-willed land, and I don't like slavery. And he said, I will go to Walden Pond for the better part of 2 years and think about it. He wrote, of course, in Wildness is the Preservation of the World. He said some great things in his journals. Of course, very few people paid much attention to Henry David Thoreau at the time he wrote. It was only in the 20th century that we began to recognize him. Kind of like Aldo Leopold, someone who needed some time before appreciation came his way. This is George Perkins Marsh, somewhat forgotten person who should be a hero to those of us at the Nicholas School. And that is a man who wrote a book called Man and Nature in 1864, right in the middle of the Civil War. George Perkins Marsh weighed 300 pounds. He could speak 21 languages. He was a diplomat, traveled widely in the Mediterranean, saw the collapse and fall of civilizations in the Mediterranean and knew about their history, and came back and reported to his countrymen. He said, we may seem like a new world, but actually we're gobbling it up pretty fast. And we need to protect our forests, we need to protect our watersheds. Much of what Marsh wrote in 1864 in this book, Man and Nature, could be published today and would seem very current and very appropriate in our discussion of environmental problems. Who's that? John Muir is right. Good. A young John Muir. We usually see him looking a little older. But John Muir in this era was heading toward California, where he arrived in the late 1860s and was looking for any place that was wild. And John Muir had the good fortune to write and live at a time when America was prepared to be interested in his message. Thoreau came a little bit too early, but by the time Muir wrote, things were changing. And this is why they were changing. We were beginning to make some serious inroads on the self-willed parts of North America. Here's 1620, 1850, North Carolina, pretty well, old growth forest pretty well gone. 1926, or let's look at it this way. People say, well, why can't you guys in the wilderness movement compromise a little bit more? And, I used to say, along with David Brower, the compromises have already been made. There they are. We're dealing with remnants. And you can see some of those remnants if you know where Big Bend is in Texas or the Everglades. There's the Great Smokies. You can see the Adirondacks, some of the areas in the west, big area out there in Yellowstone. Who's that? Going to catch it. Who said that? Teddy Roosevelt. Good for you. Good for you. He didn't like to be called Teddy, of course, as you know. He hated that name. He liked to be called Theodore Roosevelt. And there he is as a Harvard senior in 1880. And his popularity, like that of John Muir, was linked to the ending of the frontier. Ending of the frontier in 1890, same year as Pinchot got that job with the Vanderbilts. 1890, a very interesting year. The census had said no more frontier. We've always had a frontier line. It was in North Carolina, then it was in Kentucky, then it was in Illinois, kept moving west. Finally, in 1890, census said no mas. We're not going to try to describe where the frontier line is. California is already a state. Utah, they're bouncing back. So the frontier is gone. And Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian, among others, wrote about that. And in 1890, we began to think that we were perhaps getting a little bit toward middle age, that maybe some of the qualities that has sustained our culture early on, made it for better and for worse, what it was, were disappearing. 1890 was also the date of the last great Indian War, the Battle of Wounded Knee, the time of the disappearance of the bison, almost gone by 1890. Also, and I'm a popular cultural historian as well, I like to think about this, the origins in 1890, the very first league formed in professional football. And guess what? It was going to be a new frontier. They were going to call themselves Redskins. They were going to call themselves Giants or Bears or 49ers. They all played yesterday and the day before, and people love it. And it's a new frontier out there because we're finding on those fields what we were using up in the land. 1890, also the year of the establishment of the second big national park in American history, Yosemite National Park, that John Muir worked very hard for. Yellowstone the first in 1872, Yosemite the second, 1890. Again, you could think of it as a way to keep the frontier alive. There's Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir in Yosemite Park, up on Glacier Point. And there's Roosevelt pouring the conservation tonic on the balding pate of Uncle Sam. Text reads, "Uncle is getting a little thin on top." Conservation, the word comes from 1907. Gifford Pinchot claims credit for coining it, and the national forest idea coming in at the same time, just in the decade or two after the ending of the frontier. There was Roosevelt in Mississippi in 1902 on a famous bear hunt, and in this bear hunt, his host managed to chain a bear up and bring Roosevelt to it so Roosevelt could shoot the bear. But Roosevelt, being a sportsman, which was one of the origins of animal rights and of an ethical attitude toward non-human species, the idea that you didn't shoot a sitting duck, right? We still have that expression in our language. Don't shoot a sitting duck, it's a sitting duck. But the real sportsman doesn't shoot it, right? The real sportsman shoots it on the wing. So just as dead, perhaps, but at least some respect. Now here's the bear, you can see, it's got a little chain around its neck, and Roosevelt is holding his hand up saying, "No, I won't do this." Very famous political cartoon here. Roosevelt said, "I won't do this." And this cartoon appearing stimulated a toy manufacturer to produce a small stuffed bear. You know where I'm going with this, don't you? A small stuffed bear. And they actually wrote to President Roosevelt and said, "Do you mind if we call it the teddy bear?" And Roosevelt said, "Well, I don't like the name Teddy. I never refer to myself as that, but if it'll help the bear business, go for it." They produced the teddy bear, and over 1 million sold in the next 3 or 4 years. Amazing. So here we have the teddy bear, we have the birth of the Boy Scouts, 1907, we have the beginning of conservation. 1903, we have publication of a book that became one of the best sellers, American History, by Jack London, called The Call of the Wild. A perfect book, talk about being lucky with his book. London writing right after the ending of the frontier about the big dog, Buck, that was dog-napped, brought to the Yukon, put into a sled team, reverted to a wolf. At some point, most people have read that book, The Call of the Wild. 1903, enormously popular at the time. And then there was the most popular book American ever wrote, and that was, of course, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan. We already talked about that. 1912, the first Tarzan story. And you know the tale. The English aristocratic couple shipwrecked off the coast of Africa. She's pregnant, gives birth to a baby, dies, and the baby's raised by wolves. No, apes. That was a joke. Raised by apes in the jungle, right? And it's one of the most familiar storylines we have in American culture, and one of the most translated in Soul Book. The #1 bestseller is this book, Tarzan in American Literature. People always say, oh, it's Mark Twain, Fitzgerald. No, it's Edgar Rice Burroughs, the most popular American author of all time. And just to give you something to chew on, second most popular American book of all time, Storyline, written in 1933 by Franz Stryker, also about the frontier, about self-willed environments, if you will, and that would be The Lone Ranger, 1933. So we have Tarzan. We have people going out there to kind of be little Tarzans if they can. In this case, a group of Sierra Club members. Sierra Club, an organization started in 1892, 2 years after the ending of the frontier. And here's a group out with John Muir. Everybody told to bring their hat and their staff. And look at this. I love this old picture. These women were ready to go with their hat and their interesting little, what do you call them, ascots or little ties they have. And on their waist, a very bad piece of outdoor equipment called the Sierra Club cup that all these people seem to have. Sierra Club cups. They're cold, they're hot, they spill, they're no good. But they are ready to go out into the wilderness for fun, for pleasure. And that was what was so different. Thought you might like to see the first car to arrive at Glacier Point overlooking Yosemite Valley. This would be about 1905, and the guy is about 6 inches from a 3,000-foot cliff. Look at that picture. You see he's got a log under his right rear wheel, keeping him from rolling forward, and the American flag is there. He's taking his, that's Half Dome, the famous peak in the background, right? But I've always liked his girlfriend over there, wife with her hands on her hips, you know, what a dork. Looking at him about to plunge over. Thought you might like to see the first RV. You get a few of those up there in Asheville, don't you? Gatlinburg. Here's the first RV coming over Newfound Gap, perhaps. And it's all rigged out. This was Americans going back to nature. That's a sleeping bag on the fender, which is, I guess, why people didn't backpack much. But the whole thing is kind of beautifully rigged out. We began to change our ideas. This is just kind of a fun section here. We began to change our ideas about national parks and their purpose. And one of the indices to use to understand that is our attitude toward animals in national parks. Today, we would expect them to be left alone, to be self-willed, but not back then. This is a national park. They built the counter, they meaning the rangers, the Park Service in the 20s, 30s, built the counter and bleachers for people to sit. There's the Final Four. I think old Roy's got a team in that one. And there the bears are at the garbage dump. The president of the United States had a summer job guarding the tourists sitting in the front row. What was the name of that president of the United States, do you think? At Yellowstone. He was an athlete, football player. Gerald Ford is right. Very good. Gerald Ford, you guys are good. And, you know, people still fed the bears, but now it's different. You know, see, if you feed the bears, you get a ticket. You get busted. So we're finally allowing them to be wild animals. This maybe is the symbolic change that I'm talking about, most clearly seen. This is the firefall. Anybody in this room ever see the firefall in Yosemite? Did you? It stopped in 1969, and it was a big fire built on top of that point where the guy was with a car, remember Glacier Point, at dusk, and it was pushed over. There was a big call, let the fire fall, and the fire was pushed down the side of the cliff every night. Tourists loved it. Until finally people began to think, in the 60s, a time of questioning and change, is this the right thing to do? You know, I mean, should we be showing movies on the side of El Capitan or Half Dome? We could draw people in for that, but it's not the right thing to do for a national park. And so the firefall was abolished. And 3 years later, Galen Rowell, turning around after a climb of El Capitan in late February, took a picture of the real firefall, the natural firefall, if you will, a waterfall coming over Yosemite that for 2 weeks a year picks up the evening sun and turns red for about 15 minutes. It's a remarkable sight if you're lucky enough to be there and catch it. So that was a big change. But we had seen wilderness turn from a hated and feared environment to one that was cherished and protected. We had seen people get out there on the trail, even fall in love out there, and toast their relationship with the Sierra Club Cup, as they are doing. So let's jump a little bit ahead into the 20th century and look at Aldo Leopold here. I remember his wife saying, nobody would ever be interested in those papers. They've just been sitting here for 15 years. I said, well, Mrs. Leopold, let me take them, and I threw them in the back of my old crappy car and drove them to the archives. And it was a hugely important moment, because if those had been thrown out, a lot of records would have been lost. So this is Leopold as a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it was his work that not only underscored the importance of wilderness, but also created a concept of environmental ethics. And that's something that I studied in the Rights of Nature book. I was interested in how he widened the circle as an ecologist to include non-human species and natural processes. I saw a memo in those notes that I brought over there in 1961 from Leopold's house, a lecture memo in which he said that some people call wolves cruel or vicious. He said, we don't call a carburetor vicious because it consumes gasoline or fuel in an engine. We see it as part of a functioning motor. He'd written that out in longhand on one of his lecture notes. I thought that was a pretty good metaphor. So let's not look at predators as bad animals. Let's not look at deer as good animals. Let's look at them both as necessary animals. And of course it was Leopold who said, my favorite quote, the first law of successful tinkering is to save all the parts. And that was where respect for self-willed world came in. The second law of successful tinkering, I think, is to save the instructions. And that might be self-willed land and how land and ecosystems naturally function. Save all the parts and save the instructions. When Leopold died in 1948, this woman, whose name is Rachel Carson, is good. I know the people at the Duke Marine Lab are getting this one because they down there have the Rachel Carson fellowships, right? Yay. And some of you watching this probably have one of those. Congratulations. When Leopold died in 1948, Rachel Carson was completing The Sea Around Us. And in 1962, she made ecology a household word with her book Silent Spring. It was about DDT. It was about something that the press and many people called pesticides. But in another memo, like Leopold's, Rachel Carson wrote, was quoted by a reporter saying that if you use the term pesticide, you're not really getting it. What do you mean, Ms. Carson? Well, she said, pest is a very anthropocentric term. What these really are biocides. And as humans, we push too hard if we attempt to over-control. She said, I don't like the concept of antibiotics. I don't like the concept of pesticides. I don't like the idea of pests. And reminded us that it was best to not over-control, to keep some things self-willed. Rachel Carson dies in 1964. This guy, begins to achieve some prominence. I knew Ed Abbey. He's just plugged a TV. Pretty good shot, too, huh? And Ed Abbey has written Desert Solitaire in 1968, calling attention to the desert as a form of wilderness, much as Rachel Carson did to the sea around us. And Abbey led and spoke for many people by the 1970s who were very angry at what our species was doing to the natural world. And his book, The Monkey Wrench Gang of 1975, articulated that anger. So I became interested in this story and wrote about it in this book, The Rights of Nature, about the extension of ethics, about restraints on freedom. Ethics are concepts of right and wrong. They're all based on the idea of a community and the idea of restraint. And I was especially interested in how ethics had expanded over time. We're not going to spend a lot of time with this diagram, but there is something from the book, The Rights of Nature, that suggests that as the timeline moves up the left, ethics have expanded. We can put our finger on several of those expansions fairly specifically. That one from race to people would in American context be the abolition of slavery. We can look ahead to animal rights, and we can look ahead to people moving beyond that to all of life, and then even to the so-called non-living components of the environment, ecosystems. And what interested me was the expansion and the possibility that expansion could continue in the context of natural rights liberalism in America. Just as John Locke had talked about a social contract and restraints that come from the community idea, so you might think about an ecological contract, maybe not John Locke, but Aldo Leopold, thinking about further restraints that come from being a member of a broader community, not just a human community, but one that extends beyond that. I also traced in the book some of those milestones that move from natural rights there at the bottom to the rights of nature. Talking at the top about, I know it's hard to see, at least it is for me down here, it says Endangered Species Act. Can you make that out at the top? 1973, an extraordinary piece of legislation that said that listed non-human members of the American community would have certain rights to life, to liberty, to pursuit of happiness in their own terms. A path-breaking piece of legislation, as was the Wilderness Act. Where's that? Anybody know where that city is and mountain? Hard to remember that here on the Piedmont, but that's Portland, Oregon, and Mount Hood. And as sprawl continues up the sides of the mountain, it's getting hard for us to find a place to be raised by wolves, and it's getting hard for wolves to find a place to be raised by wolves. And we have been, as this picture suggests, pretty lousy neighbors on this planet. What other species would want an Endangered Species Act for us? Let's say we were threatened. Oh, we like those humans. They were great neighbors. How about the salmon? What would they say? Love them. Let's bring them back if we were disappearing. I don't think so. We could be regarded by most other forms of life as a kind of a cancer on the planet. Growth is good, but if growth destroys the system, the host dies too with the cancer, then we see the problem. And without belaboring the point, many of you in this room know it well, there's substantial grounds for thinking the ark is sinking on our watch. And I particularly, as a boater, like that concept, on our watch, and I don't like what the future will think back about us. We are the Death Star. E.O. Wilson reminds us Darwin's dice have rolled badly for Earth. And Jared Diamond, my friend and colleague from the West Coast, reminds me that civilizations have collapsed and will again. So I'm thinking about island civilization. I'm thinking about the future, and I want to talk with you a little bit about the future. want to talk about a distant future. I'm going to say the fourth millennium, way out there in 3010, 1,000 years from now. That's a meaningful unit. 1,000 years ago, we know about the Crusades. Historians can talk about it. How about 1,000 years from now? We don't think very much about it, do we? We don't have very many horizons. And I would say there are three scenarios that could take place in the future. See if you can let me stretch our minds a little bit with you. Stretch our minds just for about 5 minutes with me. First scenario is what I call the wasteland scenario. Okay, the wasteland scenario. Planet is trashed, polluted, collapsed, discarded. Maybe some of us are moving on through the galaxy to another planet to repeat the process. Ultimate ingratitude. It was a nice planet, we kind of blew it here. We deserve ourselves, but we're not entitled, I think, to take down our fellow travelers in the odyssey of evolution. And if a few handful of us still remain, a pathetic remnant on the planet, it would be living a rather pathetic life, maybe going back to or even before hunting-gathering conditions. I, for one, to me, this isn't a good scenario. I think we are a remarkable species, and we should be able to fulfill our evolutionary potential. Hang with me here. The proviso is that in so fulfilling our evolutionary potential, we don't compromise or eliminate the chance of other species fulfilling theirs. And that's where I think island civilization plays a role. So I'm rejecting the wasteland scenario. I hope it doesn't happen. How about the garden scenario? Isn't that another one that could happen in 1,000 years? Now we have total control. There's no self-willed. We control the weather. We farm the oceans. The only big animals that are around are those that we eat. The evolutionary process that produced us is pretty much toast. Nature as we knew it is dead. It's finally become all about us. And maybe there are 100 billion of us jammed onto the planet. To me, this is as much a tragedy as the wasteland scenario, because the wild world, the self-willed world is gone. So third scenario, look at your diagrams for a minute if you have one of them, is island civilization. And it stems from my advocacy of wilderness and my belief in environmental ethics. And it's a pretty simple concept, and I'll bet you already understand it from the name, and that is clustering on a planetary scale. It's implosion. It's drawing boundaries around civilization, not around wilderness. Look at the diagram. See that lower line? It's drawing boundaries around wilderness. We do now. We create a wilderness area. We fragment a wilderness area. We have a few, not many, in North Carolina. I'm looking at a world in which the matrix is wild, and our population, which I would like to see stabilize at about 1.5 billion, is clustered onto 500 islands. 1,000 years out. We're using high technology, and this is what's sort of different about my idea. See if you can hang with me on this. Many environmentalists are suspicious of technology. Even heard my friend from the Bronx talk about technology at the beginning of the talk. But I like technology. It's just that I think we've used it poorly. And we need to count on the scientists and the engineers and the architects of the future to build a society where we use it well. And that might include things like nuclear fission. It might include things like teleportation, because at island civilization, I'm looking at no roads, I'm looking at no settlement, no human impact outside those islands. What are we going to eat? We're going to fabricate our food on the islands. What are we going to do about wood? Forest history. Will there be a forest history? There'll be a forest, but there won't be any lumbering. Do you really think in 1,000 years we're going to be building with wood? At least wood that we've cut down from a tree? I don't think so. We still need a forest history society, but I think we're going to find other ways to do it. So that's island civilization. What if you don't want to live in one of those places? What about that? Well, the short answer is if you want to live a technological life, you don't have any option. You've got to live there. If you really want to go back and live a life of hunting and gathering, you can go out. And you can go out to travel. And when you do go out, you'll be in the real thing. Because the planet will have developed, reverted to self-willed qualities. So that's my thought. No roads, no dams, no terrestrial transportation, maybe teleportation. Just push a button and there you go. I can't prove it'll exist in 1,000 years, but by the same token, you can't prove it won't, can you? Can't prove it won't. So wouldn't it be good if we could push those buttons and move around like that and respect the rest of the world? Sucking ourselves in, fragmenting ourselves, and not fragmenting nature. You've got those two diagrams on the bottom, and you have the idea. Those are just some slides that do something, but this is one of the best pictures I've seen in recent years, taken by a friend. No one will get this city, but you could take a wild guess what that city is. The Winter Olympics are coming. Vancouver is right. That's Orcas Island over there on the left, and the peaks of Vancouver Island on the right. And you know, as far as a theme picture for island civilization, this isn't bad, is it? Huh? That's kind of what I mean. Can we consolidate our impact? Like the monasteries of old, like the pueblos, like the city-states, where there was vast wilderness on this planet. Civilization had little islands that we occupied. So let's imagine, as we look at the Earth rising from the moon, let's imagine, in conclusion, this planet, the Earth, in a desperate frame of mind, putting a personal's advertisement into a hypothetical intergalactic cyberspace dating service, a kind of an eharmony.com for the universe. Okay, follow me on this, it's pretty good. An eharmony.com for the universe. Here it is. Temperate but endangered planet enjoys weather, photosynthesis, glaciation, continental drift. Seeks caring long-term relationship with intelligent life form. Huh? How about that? There's the personal ad, pretty much right on. And it might work to change our species' attitudes. Maybe we do like pina coladas. After all, you know what I'm talking about there? Remember that stupid song? Do you remember it? Anybody remembers it? Yeah, they both put ads in the paper, remember? The couple breaking up. Yeah. Walks in the Rain, we're going to get some of that too. So maybe we are worth a second chance. And maybe biocentric ethics and a respect for self-willed nature, along with a healthy dose of fear, could change us from cancerous to caring. I hope you'll agree we should respond to that personal's ad. Earth just might be interested in a proposal for island civilization. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much.
We got started just a few minutes late, so we'll entertain a few questions, if you have.
How do you imagine the drop in population occurring between now and the island society?
Oh, well, I do know something about that. She said, how do I anticipate the population dropping to what we might call a sustainable level? I said 1.5 billion. Good question. And, you know, there are a lot of things I don't know about global warming, for example, or I'm not sure about, but I do know where babies come from. I understand that. It's the stork. You know, it's the stork. If we could just get control of the storks. But seriously, this is one thing where we can change the course of the Death Star. You know, this is something where the errant asteroid that maybe wiped out the dinosaurs. This is something we can control and change. And I would like to think that we might develop the resolve and the will to make that kind of a change. It seems to me the two motives that usually work in these big things are fear and love. That's what really does inspire us. Fear and love. Fear that we're going to sort of really destroy the place, and love that we have an ethic and we have a concern to protect and care for the place. You know, it's not beyond the imagination to think that government, which is a collective will of the people, I would like to go back to that kind of notion. You know, it's not a us-them thing. It should really be people deciding how to govern themselves. The government now makes some very big decisions, very personal type decisions for us in the United States. And, you know, one is a very personal item that you might say, well, it's too draconian, they'll never legislate birth control. But the one I'm thinking about that is now legislated is the number of husbands and wives we can have, you know, when you think about it. It's not true in every culture, but in this culture, we're limited to one. What if somebody says, look, I can afford 3 or 4 husbands. You know, I'd like to have 3 or 4 husbands. You know, you can't do that. It's illegal. So there's an example of where we do step up and we legislate in a very important, intimate, sort of personal issue. That gives me, as a historian, some sort of encouragement that we may be able to legislate on other things. I do believe this, that if we don't do things deliberately and by choice, it's going to be desperate. It's either deliberately or by desperation, and the time isn't that far off that that tipping point is going to occur. I have read Jared Diamond. I have thought a good deal about this. I think we'll be lucky to get through 2 or 3, 4 more generations, and I think that there will be some pressure. The big question is, will that pressure be overwhelming? But I would like to think, as an educator, that we can make these decisions deliberately, and I would like to think that an audience like this, people who are studying, people who are working to try to understand and make this world a better place, will be those who will lead the charge in such a way. How to do it? I mean, some of us are thinking about ways to do it. Maybe chips that give you a right to reproduce yourself on the planet. If you want to have 5 kids, you got to go out and buy 4 other chips from somebody who doesn't want to use them. But they're like nautical chart codes, you know, they're kind of like a one-shot code. Anyway, that's just some rambling thoughts on that, but thank you for giving me a chance to address it, and I really would like to think that we could reduce that population to about 1/4 of where we are now, because I think we have a chance to live sustainably in those islands with that kind of a population. Please, one more.
You said you talked about Aldo Leopold and the first rule of intelligent tinker and keep all the parts.
Yeah.
You mentioned the second, keeping the instructions.
Keeping the instructions, yeah.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, you know, it's those instructions that, first of all, it's the parts, like Christmas morning. You know, you've been there on Christmas morning, and they open the presents, and there's some parts, and you're trying to assemble the set, you know, whatever it is, and you see this little wheel, and you think, toss it, you know, the heck with this, we don't need this. Better not do that. Better save all the parts. And those instructions, you know, we never read them, right? Particularly guys don't read them, right? We don't need those. I can do this. Well, maybe we're not quite as smart as we think. And by instructions, I mean the way things fit together and work. Let's say in the marine environment, let's talk to our friends down at the Duke Marine Lab for a minute, if there's some of them still there listening to this. You know, they're down there studying how things work. And my read is they work better in a natural way by nature as they were evolved and intended to than they do by ways we can put together. And that's what I mean about saving the instructions, is saving on the planet some self-willed ecosystems from which we can learn how things work. Thank you very much. I'm going to be at this reception, and should we talk about animal rights at that reception, or you want to say something quick about it? One more. Okay.
I'd love just to hear your thoughts, you know, you're talking about legislating the number of children we could have. Should there be legislation that we can't keep animals, for example?
That we can't keep animals?
Can't eat animals?
Oh, can't eat animals. You know, I don't have a problem with us being part of a food chain. I do have a problem with us industrializing food, let's say. That would be good to talk about over some cheese. We don't have to eat animals. Thank you very much.